Welcome back to the Wallace branch, and today we're tackling the mining ghost town of Burke, Idaho, at the end of the Burke branch on both the Northern Pacific and the Union Pacific. It's the last major attraction on the route. The first step is creating the most important set of buildings that still exist in Burke, the concrete and steel hulks of the Hecla-Star mining complex. One thing about the construction of mines in the area of the Silver Valley, once the mines closed and the wooden buildings were gone, there's really nothing left to see. But that's not the case for the Hecla-Star. In reality, after doing the building assets of Wallace, this was one of the first buildings I tackled, and it was a lot easier than I expected despite the huge size. For one thing, I had the Sanborn insurance maps to go off of, though I had to figure out which ones to use first because those maps changed a lot over the decades after the first wooden structures burned down and then they rebuilt in concrete. I also had the Google Maps satellite view of the structures that still exist, so I had multiple resources to base this on. I decided to build 4 different structures, and I had the most fun, surprisingly, with the mine head frame. I also added in these concrete tanks, settling tanks, I think, and conveyors. I carefully studied old photos and even a YouTube exploration video from the present day to figure out how they all connected up, since those conveyors are not on the Sanborn maps. The first building you see is labeled on the map as the Hoist House. It's a pretty huge structure that still exists. It's an interesting industrial building, and I think it could be reused in other industrial settings. Then there's the long warehouse-like concrete structure that goes in sort of a bent L shape along the tracks on the upper level, and at its center is the actual head frame of the Hecla-Star mine. I think it's one of the nicest looking head frames that still exists in the West. It's sort of comparable to some of those that are in Butte or Arizona. The mine dates back to the 1890s, with the present structure dating to the 1920s. In 1923, a fire swept through the mine, destroying all of the mine buildings and most of Burke, Idaho. In 1924, the mine reopened, larger and with concrete and brick buildings, and those are the buildings that remain today. The Star Mine was in total 8,100 feet in depth, making it the deepest mine in North America. According to a review article by Mine Superintendent William Anderson, the Star Mine was producing 1,000 tons per day of ore, mainly zinc and lead in a 2-to-1 ratio. The Star ore body was first intersected on the 4,000-foot level. The first production from the Star Mine was from a crosscut from the old Hecla mine. In 1921, Bunker Hill and Hecla formed the Sullivan Mining Company. The Star Mine was rich in zinc ore, which was used to feed the electrolytic zinc plant at Kellogg. The Hecla ore body was exhausted by 1944 and abandoned, and all production from the Star Mine was using the surface plant at the Hecla mine in Burke. By the 1960s, the Hecla-Star had produced almost 6 million tons of ore, containing 7 million ounces of silver, 229,000 tons of lead, and 402,000 tons of zinc. Placing the Hecla-Star buildings was relatively simple this time, not too much digging through the terrain, and I guess that's because the terrain that exists today in the Trainz Dam, that's the same as what existed in the past. Next, you see the placing of the remainder of the buildings in Burke, along with the tracks. One of the largest buildings is the Tiger Pullman. It's a fairly major complex with a familiar look and feel. Where buildings in Burke had been added or torn down, and especially in the case of the Tiger Pullman, which was abandoned fairly early on and demolished, I erred on the side of building more. And in fact, by the 1920s, the Tiger Pullman was already partly demolished, so it definitely wasn't around at the same time as the concrete version of the Hecla-Star, and probably not at the same time as the remaining brick buildings left in Burke. Then nearby you have the famous Tiger Hotel. Even though I had the Sanborn maps of the area, it was pretty hard to get the tracks to look correct. The grade is very steep in this area and the turns are pretty tight as well. And then the most famous of all was the Tiger Portman Hotel, or just the Tiger Hotel. It was more of an employee bunkhouse than a hotel per se. It was a pretty large building for such a small town, also, and it points to how people in those days, they really had to live where they worked. The building started out as just a small gabled house-like structure and then expanded to form this large square dormitory block adjacent to the original building and connected to the lobby and kitchen area. Then, right through the center of the gable building ran the railroad tracks serving the Hecla-Star and maybe also the Tiger Portman. The hotel was not around that long, and it was already in tough shape by the 1940s, and it was eventually torn down as well, even though by the 1950s it was becoming a bit of a tourist attraction. Again, with PBR, I had some difficulties getting the textures to work. I had this siding texture, which looked like the normals were somehow upside down, not flipped normals, but upside down. So in Photoshop, I rotated the texture 180 degrees, but that didn't help. But then later, rotating the mapping in Blender, that did work to get the siding to look approximately correct, although it's still perhaps a little bit too pristine looking. I also added some nice black smoke marks where the trains pass through. The final big building asset is the Sawmill complex, which I combined with the huge ore bins at the top of the tracks. The combination is intended to help these assets fit the scenery since they exactly match their locations and dimensions from the Sanborn maps. And this meant that I wouldn't have to worry that their footprint would get out of whack. But unfortunately, it proved another difficult asset to situate into the present terrain from Transdam, and I did have to do a lot of fussing around with the terrain to place them. The big ore chutes are on the Sanborn maps. They don't appear in the photos of Burke, that I could find at least. And then the track grade is so steep that the top ore chutes are too low for loading the cars, so then I had to go back and adjust their level. In fact, I had to go back and adjust almost all the buildings in Burke to account for that slope, including the shops, the Hecla-Star structure, the Tiger Portman mine. These mine complexes are really huge, and they took a lot more time than I expected. The tracks also, you can see the complex track arrangement around the Tiger Portman in this Sanborn map, as well as in this photo. Later, the building on the left of this photo was demolished. Its location may have somewhat overlapped with the Tiger Hotel. Eventually, the entire Tiger Portman complex disappeared after the ore was exhausted. Even if the ore had not been exhausted, I don't think the Tiger Portman would have lasted to the 1970s. They probably would have had to rebuild it in a sturdier style. So this type of asset can kind of represent the town in its heyday, maybe the 1910s and early 20s. On one hand, the complex mining structures, they're magnificent, but on the other hand, they are somewhat rectilinear and they're somewhat too clean and new looking. I'd like to find ways to get details into these buildings to create more of an industrial look and ideally have them not look brand new. Redoing the UV unwrap and then using PBR Painter or Substance Painter to texture them could help, but I think it would also increase the size of the assets considerably. By using this very simple texture, I'm basically reducing the size of the model. So effectively, I'm pushing pause on doing anything about the way this asset looks in game. Welcome any suggestions. Coming back to the Hecla and Tiger Portman mines in Burke, the really extraordinary thing about them, and the reason for modeling this area, is that the town was famous as a boomtown in the narrow valley with two railroad tracks, the ORN or Union Pacific, and then the Northern Pacific, running down the main street and serving the mines that were basically right in town or just above the town. Down the valley by the Hecla-Star and just below the Tiger Portman is where the famous Main Street with the two tracks was located. I used a combination of the Sanborn maps, photos, and some Google images to recreate the street scene. A few of the buildings are really iconic, and I played that up. For example, the combination bar and barber shop, and the gas station without any parking area except the street itself, which has tracks running through it as well. I decided to add an elaborate mobile marquee just to make things interesting, and I think it gives the place a nice 1920s or 30s look. The town of Burke also extended both north and south of the main street and mining complexes. As you can see, I just pasted assets from other towns for both areas. When I was doing the town, I had started to apply PBR textures and glass textures to most of my building assets, but I hadn't mastered that technique, in my opinion. The shop buildings look a little bit too plain and they don't have much character. I'd say the town that I ended up with represents a compromise that I'd like to ideally come back to. However, those small town buildings, they're not the main attraction. It's more the tracks through town and the mines on the side of the valley. It's the whole package, not the individual building assets per se. As usual, when you first place the assets down on the map, they don't really look very impressive, but adding shrubs and details helps blend them in and brings out the unity of the location. Adding the creek, which passed underneath most of the buildings along the street, that also adds a bit of interest, though it's not perfect by any means. I tried to vary the look of the creek by using different splines to create walkways alongside of the buildings that cross over it. And I also added some of the mountainside covered narrow gauge track splines. And I also added the aerial tramway up to the Hercules mine on the hillside, which is far above Burke.
And my favorite final touch is always the historical markers. This is a spot overlooking the location of the former Frisco mill, which was blown up during a labor conflict in July 1892. 6 men were killed and dozens more were wounded in the gunfire and battles that erupted there. Railroads had raised rates and refused to negotiate with the mining companies, and so the mining companies in the Coeur d'Alene district had banded together and just closed their mines until the railroads came to terms, throwing thousands of miners out of work. And then when the mines reopened, the mining companies announced that the working shifts would be increased by 1 hour per day, but with no extra pay, just $3.50 for a 10-hour shift. So the miners went on strike, and the mine owners simply brought in non-union workers from as far away as Michigan and Duluth, via train, of course. And each trainload of workers was guarded by up to 60 Pinkerton detectives on their way from the station to their work. Violence between armed guards and non-union workers on one side, and then union men on the other, increased steadily, and when union miners surrounded the Gem and Frisco mines, a firefight broke out. To get at the guards and non-union miners who were protected behind and inside the Frisco mine buildings, the union men sent a box of explosives down a water flume into one of the older mine buildings, destroying it but killing only 1 man inside. Not long after that, the Frisco waved the white flag of surrender, setting the stage for even more drama, as the Union men, who were now in total control of Burke and Gem, hitched on Northern Pacific rail cars down to Kellogg. There, they blew up the Bunker Hill concentrator, as we already discussed. So I represented the Frisco by what's left above ground today, which is a barren patch and some timbers scattered around.
And there you have it, the mostly completed ghost town of Burke, Idaho, brought back to life in Trainz. I can't wait to experiment to see if this track layout is actually operable. That's still to come, because even though Burke is our last town on the route, there's still more to this build. Next time, we'll be heading up to Lookout Pass to fill in some of the blank parts of the map. So, if you'd like to come along, like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.